There was a hiss of static in his helmet, followed by silence. No more voices from mission control. Just silence. For a moment, he thought it was a malfunction, just a glitch in the system. It had to be. He toggled the comm switch again, adjusting the frequency, trying the emergency channels. Still nothing. He stood there, the dust of the moon kicking up gently with his movements. The earth hung in the sky above him, a pale blue marble, distant and fragile. He stared at it for what felt like hours, but no message came. His heart started to pound, his breath quickened, and he realized something was wrong. Deeply wrong. The mission wasn't supposed to end like this. They had been up here for months, testing systems, gathering data, routine work. It was always supposed to be routine. But the last few days had been chaotic. The frantic chatter from Earth, the abrupt halt to their scheduled transmissions. He had shrugged it off. Technical issues, maybe. Now, standing outside the base, the reality hit him. They had left. How could they forget him? He sprinted back inside the lunar habitat, slamming the door behind him, sealing off the harsh void outside. He stripped off his suit, panting, and rushed to the console. Maybe he could still reach them. Maybe it wasn't too late. His fingers flew across the controls, punching in commands to reconnect to Earth. Static. He tried again. Static. His breath came in shallow bursts now, but he forced himself to calm down. He couldn't afford to lose his head. He needed to think. He activated the emergency distress beacon, nothing. That should have triggered something. Anything. But the silence was total. He scanned through old data logs, looking for any hint, any clue. That's when he noticed it, the last few signals from Earth were faint, erratic. Something had happened down there. But what? His mind raced with possibilities. An invasion? War? Natural disaster? The cause didn't matter, not now. What mattered was that he was alone. Completely alone. The lunar base felt suddenly smaller, more confined, more hostile than it ever had. He moved through the narrow corridors, inspecting the supplies. Food and water, rationed for the crew, were ample enough for one person, but how long could he last up here? Weeks? Months? He didn't even know if anyone would come back. If they could. He couldn't shake the feeling of isolation, the absolute stillness around him. He had always been a team player, relying on his crew, his connection to Earth. Now, it was just him. The moon stretched out, barren and lifeless, but he had to survive. That's what humans did. He'd adapt, no matter what. He had been trained for this, drilled endlessly for every kind of disaster scenario. But this? He was completely on his own. He tried the comms again. Static filled the air. Okay, he thought, focus. He went through the protocols, running diagnostics on the base. Oxygen level stable. Power holding. Life support fully operational. He checked the solar panels, working fine, at least for now. He had time. What he didn't have was answers. He couldn't even tell what had gone wrong down there, but whatever it was, it had left him forgotten, stranded. He paced back and forth in the small confines of the habitat, trying to make sense of it all. His thoughts flickered to his family back on Earth. Were they safe? Were they even alive? He had no way of knowing. That was the hardest part, the not knowing. And yet, in the face of it all, he could feel a spark of something else inside him. A drive. He wasn't going to die here, forgotten, stranded. If Earth had gone silent, then he would find a way to reach them. If they didn't come for him, he'd figure it out himself. He was human. Humans survived. Humans adapted. He kept a routine, because it was the only thing keeping him sane. Morning checks on the life support systems, inventorying supplies, recalibrating the solar panels. Every day was a loop, a cycle of survival. He'd learned early on that keeping busy was crucial, because the silence was worse than anything else. Days passed with no word from Earth. Weeks. He would sit in front of the console, headset on, staring at the blinking red lights, waiting for something, anything, to come through. Static. Every time. He tried different frequencies, tried boosting the signal, but the result never changed. At first, he rationalized it. Maybe Earth was dealing with something big, something massive enough that communication had broken down. He didn't know what it was, but his mind raced with possibilities. Maybe a solar flare had knocked out the satellites. Maybe there was some kind of conflict. But it wouldn't last forever, right? Someone would get the systems back online. Someone would notice he was up here, waiting. But as the days stretched into weeks, doubt crept in. There were no news updates, no background chatter. It wasn't just that the mission control had stopped talking, it was everyone. All the channels were dead. He started to run through worst-case scenarios in his head. Maybe there had been a war, or an invasion. Maybe the Earth he knew was gone. It was hard to imagine, but the silence was too total to be anything else. If it had just been a glitch, they would have fixed it by now. In the back of his mind, he knew something catastrophic must have happened. It had to be big, big enough to knock humanity off course entirely. He tried not to think about it, tried to push the thought away, but it was always there, gnawing at him. Still, he kept himself going. He made careful decisions about rationing. Food and water were finite, but he figured out ways to stretch them. He repaired the minor issues with the life support system, cleaned the filters, checked and rechecked the oxygen levels. These tasks, these small actions, they gave him a sense of control. As long as he could keep the systems running, as long as he could maintain the base, he would be okay. He had to believe that. But in the still moments, when there was nothing left to fix, nothing left to do, the thoughts would come. He'd think about his family back home. His wife. His daughter. He hadn't been able to speak to them before the silence started. They were supposed to have a video call, but that was before everything went wrong. Now he didn't even know if they were alive. The memories came to him, vivid and painful. His daughter's laugh. The way his wife would tease him about his work, calling him Mr. Moonman. He'd thought they were safe on Earth, but now, with each passing day of silence, that hope was eroding. He found himself staring at the Earth sometimes, sitting by the window of the habitat, looking up at the pale blue sphere. There was something wrong with it. It didn't look the same. He couldn't explain it, but it felt off. The light, the color, it seemed dimmer. He knew he had to investigate, but he was afraid of what he might find. The isolation was starting to get to him. He tried to keep it together, but the constant quiet was maddening. No voices, no news, no sounds except the faint hum of machinery. He was beginning to feel more like a ghost than a person. He had no way to confirm it, but the creeping suspicion that he might be the only one left was growing stronger every day. But he wouldn't let himself fall into despair. He couldn't. There had to be someone out there. He refused to believe he was the last. He refused to give in to that crushing thought. No matter what had happened to Earth, no matter how long the silence stretched, he held on to one thing: hope. Hope that someone, somewhere, was still alive. And that they would find him. The day came when he couldn't ignore it anymore. The nagging feeling that Earth was different, that something was wrong, he needed to know. He powered up the old satellite array, a piece of equipment that had been sitting dormant for ages. It was meant for basic observations, nothing high-tech, but it could give him a view of Earth. It took a few tries to get it running, but eventually, the feed came to life. What he saw froze him in place. Earth was a shadow of itself. The once vibrant blue-green planet was darkened, its surface marked with scars that stretched across continents. Vast swaths of land looked blackened, burned out. The atmosphere seemed hazy, as if the world itself had been smothered by a cloud of ash and dust. No lights, no signs of civilization, no movement. The Earth he had left behind was gone. He stared at the image, numb. It was one thing to imagine disaster, but to see it, to actually witness the destruction, it felt like a punch to the gut. He zoomed in, scanning familiar regions, looking for something, anything. But there was nothing. Major cities were barely recognizable, reduced to dark smudges on the surface. It wasn't clear whether it had been a war or something else, but the result was unmistakable: Earth was dead. The enormity of it hit him all at once. His hands shook, his throat tightened, and he felt the tears coming, but he fought them back. Crying wouldn't change anything. This was reality now. The silence, the lack of response, this was why. There was no one left to respond. He sank into the chair, staring blankly at the screen. The weight of it all pressed down on him like gravity. He was alone. He might be the only human being left alive. The thought felt too big to process, too overwhelming to fully comprehend. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to think, but his mind was spinning in circles. What was the point now? Who was he surviving for? His thoughts drifted to humanity as a whole. Billions of people, generations of life, culture, achievements, gone in an instant. He had never really considered how fragile it all was, how easily it could all end. Civilization, society, technology, everything humans had built over millennia, wiped out in the blink of an eye. It felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. But it was real. The planet he had called home was nothing more than a lifeless husk. He thought about his crew, the people he had trained with, worked with, lived with up here. Had they made it back to Earth only to face this destruction? Had they been caught in whatever catastrophe had unfolded? And his family, that thought hurt the most. His wife and daughter. Were they part of the silent ashes now? He felt the weight of grief pressing on him, heavy and cold. But somewhere in the depth of his sorrow, there was a flicker, a question. What now? What was left? He could end it. Just stop. It would be so easy to let go, to stop fighting. There was no one left to know, no one left to care. But that wasn't who he was. That wasn't what humanity was. Humans didn't just quit. Even in the face of total annihilation, even when there was no logical reason to keep going, humans pushed forward. It was in their nature. He looked back at the darkened image of Earth and made a decision. He wouldn't give up. He couldn't. If he was the last human alive, then he owed it to every person who had ever lived to keep going. To survive. He didn't know how, or for how long, but he wasn't going to let humanity end in silence. He was still here. That mattered. He mattered. As long as he was breathing, there was hope. Maybe it was irrational, maybe it was pointless, but he clung to it anyway. The world might have fallen, but he wasn't going to let the legacy of humanity fade away. He would find a way to survive, to carry on. Because that's what humans did. Days blurred together, but something inside him shifted. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was planning, thinking ahead. Earth might be lost, humanity might be gone, but it didn't have to be the end of the story. Not if he could help it. He turned his attention to the technology around him. The base had everything he needed: advanced systems, data storage, communication arrays. He wasn't an engineer, but he was trained to improvise. If he was the last human alive, then he had a responsibility. Not just to himself, but to everyone who had come before him. Humanity's legacy couldn't just disappear. There had to be something left, something that told their story, even if no one was left to hear it. He sat down at the console, activating the recording systems. For a moment, he just stared at the blinking cursor, unsure where to start. How did you sum up an entire species, an entire world? He began by recording a simple message. His name, his mission, the date, though the concept of time felt strange now. He explained what had happened, at least from his limited perspective, speaking directly to the unknown future, to whatever or whoever might find these records. He documented the basics first: human history, key events, breakthroughs in science, art, technology. He wanted to capture it all, not just the triumphs but the struggles too. Humanity wasn't perfect, far from it, but that imperfection was part of what made them remarkable. Their ability to learn from mistakes, to adapt, to rise again even after devastating setbacks, that was the essence of who they were. He spent hours, days, compiling information. He recorded personal logs, sharing his thoughts, his memories. He talked about Earth, what it had been like, the beauty of it, the diversity. He spoke about the people he had known, the lives that had touched his. He wanted whoever found this, whether it was some future human, or an alien species, or even just the cold vacuum of time itself, to understand that humanity had mattered. There were moments when he couldn't help but reflect on how they'd ended up here. How had it all fallen apart? What had led to the disaster? He didn't know for sure, but he had his suspicions. Greed, war, perhaps a failure to recognize their own fragility. It was bitter to think about, but he didn't let it consume him. Because humanity wasn't just about its flaws, it was about its capacity to dream, to create, to push boundaries. That's what he wanted to preserve. As he worked, a quiet resolve grew inside him. This wasn't just a project, it was his purpose now. He wasn't just waiting for the end. He was building something, crafting a testament to what humanity had been. Maybe no one would ever find it, maybe it would drift through the endless void, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the effort, the intent. He meticulously stored everything he could, written logs, video recordings, data archives. He even began to sketch out a time capsule of sorts, something that could survive beyond the base, beyond him. It was an idea, just an idea, but he toyed with ways to encode the information, to make it last. If he had the time, he would make sure that whatever happened, there would be a record of their existence. In quieter moments, he allowed himself to think about what it meant to be human. The highs and lows, the contradictions. He thought about how they had reached for the stars, how they had built wonders and yet could destroy so easily. He thought about how, even in the face of certain doom, there was always this drive, this unshakable need to keep going. Humanity's story didn't have to end in fire and silence. Not if he could help it. There would be something left. Even if he was the last of them, their story would endure. He felt a strange calm in that thought. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could still act, still create, still hope. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something new, something that could last. And in that, humanity would too. Unbeknownst to him, his actions weren't entirely in vain. Far beyond the moon's cold surface, beyond the lifeless planets and the dead silence of space, there were watchers. They had been observing Earth for centuries, monitoring humanity's progress with a detached curiosity. Their role wasn't intervention, it was observation. To study the strange, unpredictable species that had clawed its way up from the dust and reached for the stars, all while teetering on the brink of destruction. At first, they had only seen humans as another fleeting civilization. Many had come before, and many would follow, each burning bright before fading into obscurity. But something about humanity was different. They weren't just survivors, they were creators, dreamers. They had a stubborn resilience, a refusal to go quietly into the dark. And now, they were watching the last human, a single man alone on the moon, who carried on the legacy of his entire race, even when no one was left to witness it. Or so he thought. The beings watched him work, documenting everything, preserving what he could of his world. They saw his quiet determination, his refusal to give in to despair. It fascinated them. Civilizations often crumbled in the face of such total annihilation, but here was one person, clinging to hope in the most hopeless of situations. And it wasn't just for himself. He was fighting to preserve something greater, something intangible but deeply human, their story. They had watched the fall of Earth, knowing that it was inevitable, but they hadn't expected this. They hadn't anticipated that one human, stranded and forgotten, would continue long after the collapse. It was both inspiring and perplexing. What drove him? What was the purpose of his actions when no one else was there to witness them? The being leading the observation had seen countless worlds rise and fall. And yet, there was something in this man's resilience that sparked something unfamiliar, something almost like admiration. It had always been assumed that once Earth fell silent, that would be the end. But perhaps they had underestimated these humans. They watched as the man completed his recordings, meticulously archiving the story of his species. His hands moved with precision, his expression calm but resolute. He had made his peace with what had happened, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The alien observers had never intervened before. It wasn't their way. But this situation felt different. The humans' perseverance in the face of extinction was compelling, in a way they hadn't expected. And it planted a question in their minds: was it worth letting this legacy fade into nothingness? The man, of course, was unaware of the eyes upon him. He continued his work, believing that the end was near but determined to leave something behind. When he wasn't recording, he spent time looking at the stars, imagining what might be out there. He thought about the possibilities, the endless potential of the universe. Maybe one day, someone, or something, would find his records. Maybe humanity's story would live on, even if they didn't. There was a moment, brief but profound, when he felt the weight of the universe around him. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was more like a connection to something far greater than himself, a sense that perhaps, even in the vast emptiness of space, he wasn't truly alone. He brushed the feeling aside, assuming it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the watchers knew. They had made a decision, though he would never know it. As the days stretched on, the man prepared for what he believed would be his final act. He wasn't afraid anymore. He had done all he could. His records were complete, his work finished. Whatever came next, he was ready. He spent his last hours gazing out at the stars, wondering if anyone would ever find his message. Far above, the observers quietly debated. Should they act? Should they allow this final human's efforts to disappear into the void? The decision wasn't made lightly. But in the end, they realized something important: humanity's legacy didn't deserve to be lost. And so, as the man sat on the barren surface of the moon, unknowingly under the watchful eyes of beings he had never dreamed existed, a silent message was sent across the stars. He wouldn't know it, but his story had reached beyond Earth, beyond the solar system. His perseverance had sparked something far greater than he could have imagined. Perhaps his message wouldn't be lost after all.